In March of 2002, a man named John Darwin paddled a canoe into the North Sea and never came back. His wife told police that he was missing. Search boats spent days combing the water, and eventually his smashed-up canoe washed onto a beach, but there was no body, and a court declared him legally dead.
It was a massive search. We were called out at 1 a.m. on the 22nd of March to search for a person that had been reported missing from Hartlepool in a canoe. And it involved 6 RNLI lifeboats, an RAF Sea King helicopter, an RAF Nimrod aircraft, the police aircraft, and numerous shore parties searching the full length of the coast, all the way from Seaton Carew down to Saltburn.
His wife collected £250,000 in life insurance and pension payouts. Neighbors brought her casseroles, and she cried at his memorial. And for most of that time, John Darwin was living about 12 feet away from her, behind a wardrobe in a house next door. There was an actual door hidden behind a wardrobe, like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe book, and on the other side of it was John Darwin, alive, bored out of his mind, and apparently fine with letting his sons believe that he had drowned. This is Scareful Stories, and today we're talking about the Canoe Man, the case that turned faking your own death into a British national punchline. The mystery here isn't whether John survived the canoe trip, because obviously he did. The mystery is how 2 ordinary people ran this lie for 5.5 years through a funeral, an inquest, a police investigation, and a library card before it all came apart because of one unlucky photograph in Panama. Hi, and welcome back to the channel. Here, I share Scareful Stories. If you're new, I'd love it if you would subscribe, give the video a like, and I would really appreciate it if you'd leave a comment. And now, on to the story of John Darwin, known as the Canoe Man, even though, interestingly, he was actually in a kayak. John Darwin was in his early 50s in 2002, living in Seaton Carew, a seaside town on the northeast coast of England. He'd worked as a teacher and then spent years as a prison officer, and somewhere along the way, he and his wife Anne had built up a decent little property business, renting out flats around town. On paper, everything looked really stable, but underneath it, as for so many people, the Darwins were about £64,000 in debt. John, by most accounts, was the one who kept making the decisions that dug that hole ever deeper. At some point in the months before March of 2002, John pitched Anne an idea, and it wasn't a small idea. He said he wanted to disappear at sea, get declared dead, let her collect the insurance and pension money, and then quietly resurface, perhaps as a new person with a new identity, and start fresh somewhere warm. Anne has said that she agreed to this plan, although reluctantly, because she felt she didn't have any other option that didn't end in the couple losing their house. What I find really fascinating is that the motive is one a lot of people have. It's not like they were running from organized crime or fleeing some international conspiracy. They were in debt, like millions and millions and millions of other people. So many people are in debt, but how many of them decide that the solution is to fake a drowning? And if you haven't seen my other video on the man who faked his death while out on a lake, that one wasn't so much about money, although he was in debt too, but he had met a woman halfway around the world and wanted to be with her, so he faked his own death. I'll link that video below. On March 21st, 2000, a neighbor saw John paddling his kayak out onto Tees Bay. That was the last confirmed sighting. He didn't show up to work, and Anne ended up reporting him missing. The Coast Guard launched a search that covered more than 60 square miles of coastline. The sea that day was unusually calm enough that rescuers were genuinely puzzled about how capsizing could have even happened. A double-ended paddle and the wrecked kayak turned up on the shore, but John never did. An inquest returned an open verdict, and then, in 2003, 13 months after he had vanished, a coroner formally declared him dead. Anne played the grieving widow. She went on to collect £250,000 between his life insurance and pension payouts. and she used a chunk of it to pay off her mortgage. Anne didn't just take the money, though. She sat through a memorial service, and she accepted condolence cards and casseroles from her neighbors. She let them ask her how she was holding up, and she told her 2 grieving sons that their father was gone. For over a year, Anne wasn't just filing paperwork with an insurance company. She performed her role as a widow full-time, while the man she was mourning was just a short walk away. According to the account Anne later gave, she picked him up in Cumbria a few weeks after his accident and brought him back to Seaton Carew. The Darwins owned 2 adjoining properties. They had their family home and the building next door that had been split into 2 bedsits. John moved into one of those bedsits, and somewhere along the line, a hidden doorway was built behind a wardrobe connecting his hideout directly into the house that Anne was still living in, now as a widow. And here's where the whole thing turns into something that makes it kind of farcical. John grew a beard, and he started to walk with a limp and a cane, whether or not he needed one, and he dressed in clothes he found in charity shops. He even concreted over a section of the floorboards in the passage between his bed and Anne's house so that it wouldn't creak and give him away if somebody came to the door. And, as it turns out, a lot of people would come to Anne's door. She had visitors and deliveries, neighbors stopping by for chats, and John would hear the knocking, duck through the wardrobe, and sit quietly next door while Anne played the widow, living alone, making small talk. She would maybe offer her guest tea, and then she would send the people on their way, and John would come back through the passageway, and Anne and him would talk about who had just stopped by. That happened over and over again for years. And, amazingly, there was never a slip in front of the wrong person. He didn't just sit in the dark, though, feeling sorry for himself. A month and a day after he supposedly drowned, John walked into the Seaton Carew library and signed up for a card, but not under his own name. He signed up under a name he had found by digging through old newspapers and gravestones until he found someone whose identity he could borrow. The name he landed on was the ever-so-unique John Jones. The real John Jones had been born in Sunderland in March of 1950, which was just a few months before John Darwin had been born. But John Jones had died at 5 weeks old from an infection. A baby who had barely lived a month became the paper trail for a grown man hiding from his own funeral. In 2003, using that dead child's birth certificate, Darwin actually got himself a genuine UK passport in the name of John Jones. That document allowed him a lot more freedom. He wasn't confined to Seaton Carew anymore. He could travel, he could open up accounts, and he could exist on paper as somebody else entirely. So John and Anne's plot and their whole idea was working out pretty nicely at this point. But then people started noticing things. But what's really interesting is they didn't really seem to do anything about it. At one point, a tenant in the bedsit building recognized him, even with his beard and his disguise and the cane. And he said more or less, "Aren't you supposed to be dead?" And John's answer was simply to ask him not to tell anyone. And the tenant didn't tell anyone. The tenant would later say that he just didn't want to get involved. Neighbors reported odd noises and shapes moving behind windows in a house that was supposedly only occupied by one person. And nobody connected the dots, or maybe just nobody wanted to. Once he had the John Jones passport, John started moving around more freely, flying in and out of the country, opening bank accounts, and doing the small ordinary things that build a life. Every one of those moments was a chance for someone to just ask a question that he wouldn't be able to answer, maybe a passport officer or a bank clerk or a fellow passenger who thought his face looked a little bit familiar. But luckily for John, none of them ever did. By 2004, with the passport obtained, the Darwins started thinking bigger than just a bedsit with a hidden door. They looked at Cyprus first. In November of that year, they flew out to view property there. John traveling under the false name with Anne right beside him, a dead man using a dead baby's identity, walking through airport security next to the wife who just collected his life insurance. And amazingly, nobody knew and nobody stopped them. The plan to move to Cyprus, though, fizzled out, and their attention then shifted to Panama, which had a reputation at the time as an easy place for foreigners to buy property and settle into without a lot of questions asked. By 2006, they were spending time there, funded by the insurance and pension money, plus proceeds from selling off some of their UK properties. Anne eventually sold the Seaton Carew house outright, making more than £295,000, some of it funneled through the Channel Islands on its way to Panama. Between the insurance payout and the property sales, this was, by any measure, one of the most lucrative fake deaths in modern British history. If they'd stopped there, they might have gotten away with it. But on July 14, 2006, while they were out apartment hunting in Panama, a local property agent snapped a photo of the two of them together, smiling and doing the completely mundane thing of house hunting as a couple. The agent posted the picture on the website of his relocation company. It was just a promotional photo that real estate agents put up constantly, and no one gave any thought about. John and Anne, though, didn't know it was there. It sat there completely unnoticed for a year and a half. By late 2007, the Panama plan was hitting a wall. Problems were coming up. New immigration rules meant that John would need an investor visa to stay there legally, and that meant that his identity documents would finally get checked properly by UK authorities. A passport built on a dead infant's birth certificate was fine for casual travel, but it was not going to survive the kind of scrutiny that an investor visa would get. The John Jones identity, the one piece of paper that his entire second life ran on, was about to become useless. So John, being the brilliant person who came up with the first plan to fake his death, came up with a new plan. He'd walk back into Britain, drop the John Jones name entirely, and reappear as the same person that he is, John Darwin. He would say that he was a confused amnesiac who had simply lost track of the last 5 years of his life. If it worked, he'd be cleared as a genuine missing person instead of a wanted one, and he and Anne could go back to Panama with nothing hanging over them. It wasn't the plan they'd been running since 2002, but it was a second con, layered on top of the first, and he invented it in so much of a hurry that I'm not quite sure he thought through that no one was going to believe him. On December 1st of 2007, John Darwin walked into a police station in central London and told the officer behind the desk, "I think I'm a missing person." And that's not a paraphrase. That's what he actually chose to say. His sons, Mark and Anthony, were told that their father had turned up alive after 5.5 years of believing he drowned. A statement went out saying that he claimed amnesia stretching back to the year 2000, meaning that he supposedly couldn't account for even the 2 years prior to the kayak trip, let alone the 5 years after it. Imagine being his sons and getting that phone call. The father you buried and grieved for over 5 years is just now standing in a police station a few miles away, and the explanation on offer is that his mind is simply blank. At first, both sons seem to have accepted the story, or at least they desperately wanted to. Neither had any reason yet to suspect that their own mother had been in on this whole thing from the start. For a few days, the British press actually ran with the amnesia angle and were quite sympathetic to John. He was a missing husband back from the dead, unable to remember where he'd been or what had happened. And that's a really strange story, but it's also quite heartwarming if you take it at face value. Reporters wrote it up as a mystery of the mind rather than a mystery of the wallet. But that window of sympathy and kindness didn't last long. Police started digging, and the story didn't hold up. When the Metropolitan Police contacted Cleveland Police, the force that had handled the original 2002 disappearance, the timeline didn't add up cleanly. Around the same time, A woman who wasn't a detective and had no connection to the case read about it and got curious. She typed 3 words into a search engine: John, Anne, and Panama. And there it was, the 2 of them beaming next to their property agent, time-stamped months after John was supposedly lying dead at the bottom of the North Sea. She sent it anonymously to both the police and to the Daily Mirror newspaper. The paper ran it under the headline, "Canoes This in Panama," and that was the end of the amnesia story. John Darwin was arrested on December 5th, 2007 at his son Anthony's home in Hampshire on suspicion of fraud. Anne was in Panama at the time, and rather than staying hidden, which might have been smart, she went public. She gave an interview to a British newspaper admitting that she'd known the whole time that John was alive. So she actually changes her story a couple of times. And in this version, the one she gives the British newspapers is she says that he went out, disappeared, and then shows up at the door looking thin and dirty. And in her words, he smelled dreadful. But then at another time, she tells the police that she actually picked him up and that he didn't just show up back at the house. She knew he was leaving, knew he was going to fake his death, and they organized the whole thing. She waits for him. He tips over the kayak or the canoe and then swims to shore, gets in her car. They drive to like a hotel in towns away, and he stays there for a little bit before they finally manage to sneak him back home. Police searched the Seaton Carew property and found the hidden room behind the wardrobe and John Jones' passport and the paperwork tracing the insurance claims that Anne had filed. Anne flew back to Britain fully expecting to be arrested, and not surprisingly, she was. The tabloids had an absolute field day. Headlines called Anne every version of lying that the English language allows. Someone in Seaton Carew put up a fake road sign reading, "Welcome to Seaton Canoe, twinned with Panama." Every canoe pun a British newspaper could physically construct got used at least once, despite the fact that Darwin had technically been paddling a kayak and not a canoe, which I guess at this point, who really cares? And I think actually in England, they use canoe and kayak somewhat interchangeably, whereas I think here in the United States, we really don't. I guess I always call it what it actually is. By the time both Darwins were sentenced in 2008, one tabloid described John heading into prison as one of the most disliked inmates in the entire British prison system, which is a fairly remarkable reputation to earn when all you've done is commit fraud. There was no violence really involved in this, unless you want to include the mental violence, if you want to think of it that way, to his own children, which is just really shocking that any parent could do that. In court, John pleaded guilty, which is generally what happens when there's a fake passport, a hidden room, and a photo of you looking very much alive in Panama sitting on the prosecutor's desk. Anne pleaded not guilty and went to trial, where both of her sons testified against her. Betty Broderick, anyone? In July of 2000, she was convicted on 6 counts of fraud and 9 counts of money laundering. She was sentenced to 6.5 years. John, because of his guilty plea, got 6 years and 3 months, technically a shorter sentence than his wife, despite him being the one who came up with the plan in the first place. John was released from prison in January of 2011, and Anne was released that March. And this is where the story really just is sad, because the fallout for their sons didn't end when the sentences did. Mark and Anthony grieved their father, who wasn't even dead, then testified against their own mother, who had lied to them for over 5 years, and then they had to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, they wanted to have with either parent going forward. Anne eventually rebuilt something with both of her sons. Mark has spoken publicly about how hard that process was, saying it took real work to reach a place where he could forgive her. John's path, however, went the other way. He moved to the Philippines, remarried, and by most accounts has had no contact with his sons since. And you think about this and you think after all that, they got divorced. I mean, I can imagine the stress of that. And I'm guessing Anne probably kind of blamed him. But gosh, you'd think if you went through all of that and you did all of this so that you could move to Panama and like spend your whole retirement together, you'd think maybe you could make the marriage work at that point. The real John Jones is the one who seems to be forgotten. The baby whose identity Darwin stole to build his fake life upon had a real family. Decades later, John Jones's brother learned that a stranger had used his dead infant sibling's name to fake a passport and vanish, and he spent years afterwards trying to get an apology out of Darwin. Not surprisingly, I don't think that ever happened. He never really got the closure he was after. Even the identity Darwin borrowed to disappear belonged to a real family that had already lost enough. So, why did this story take over British headlines the way that it did? And why does it still get retold in documentaries and dramas nearly 2 decades later? Well, I think a big part of it is just the sheer audacity and the mechanics of it. This wasn't a man who vanished to a different country, and he didn't start over cleanly. Instead, he hid behind a wardrobe and had a secret passage built so that he could move back and forth and sometimes live with his wife and sometimes be alone. He got a library card a month after his own death, and he built a new legal identity using a dead baby's birth certificate. Every step of this plan should have been the moment that it fell apart, but somehow it held together for quite a long time until some woman decided to type 3 words into a search bar and find a photograph. The part of the story that really stays with me here at the end isn't so much the insurance fraud or the wardrobe or the passport. It's what it did to Mark and Anthony, 2 sons who had buried their father and grieved him genuinely for 5.5 years, and then to find out that both of their parents had lied to them the entire time. Their mother had known that their father was alive and close enough to hear them through a wall, and yet neither of them bothered to say a word. And that part of the story isn't funny at all, no matter how many canoe puns the tabloids managed to squeeze out of it. We may never know exactly how much John thought this through before his first paddle out into the bay, or whether Anne truly saw it as somebody else's plan that she simply went along with. So I'll leave that one with you. What do you think was really going on in John Darwin's head? And what was going on in Anne's? Let me know in the comments. And until next time, stay safe, stay careful, and if you're going to fake your own death, maybe don't pose for pictures in Panama. Bye, guys.